Hi all. So today we're going to get into chapter 17, which is over oligopolies. And this is actually one of the more interesting market structures. This is where we get into some of the bigger, more expensive things we deal with on a daily basis. So what do we mean when we say oligopoly? Simply put, an oligopoly is a market with only a few sellers selling a similar or identical. And the key way to understand the oligopoly is rather than the market structures which we've been studying for in the case of perfect competition, monopoly, and monopolistic competition, we study oligopolies through a game. And this is the study of how people behave in strategic situations. Now, on the next slide, an example of duopoly, i.e., a market with only two competitors for we're going to look at that single good, which is bulk. Now, in this duopoly, notice that basically if we plotted out the demand for water for the entire market, what we'd find is basically for every increment the price of $10 from $120 10 gallons of water. So at $120, 0 gallons of water a demand, $110, 10 gallons of water a demand, and so on and so on. Now notice that at 60 times 60, we get our revenue and also our highest total profit, which is 3,600. So we go from 0 total revenue to 3,600 total revenue. And then at this point, we start decreasing our total revenue and total profit once. That's a little bit of a mathematical reason, but it's a great point for understanding what we're going to get at here later in this chapter. So basically, oligopolies, they face this similar problem of demand. They want to maximize their profit and they want to maximize their total revenue. However, ultimately, they're constrained, right, by the fact that they don't have the entire demand curve like, say, a monopolist. What this means is that when they decide to their goods, they're not just producing the amount they like to produce, they're producing to an amount that they think, based upon what other market or other firms are going to do, will maximize the company's total. So this is an example of a game theory where basically firms choose how much they want to produce. If they all produce too much, the price goes down, they all lose out on revenue. So how can they circumvent this problem? Well, collusion is a key way they could do this. And collusion is an agreement among firms in a market about quantities to produce or prices to charge. Basically, if in our example of water, two companies know that $60 and 60 units of water is where revenue is max, they must collude to set a particular ratio for both firms. And when companies are able to collude in such a manner, they're what we call a cartel. And a cartel is a group of firms acting in unison and can effectively coordinate to maximize each other's revenues. An example of this is OPEC. OPEC is the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries. It's led by Saudi Arabia, Russia, Venezuela, many other oil exporting countries. So basically, this cartel has typically set the oil production across all markets and ultimately determined what the price of gas is. By the way, that's why gas was so exceptionally high over the 2000s, as OPEC was driving. However, it's hard to keep these companies going this long. Equilibrium for oligopolies is difficult to maintain because squabbling occurs. And this is where entering game theory and Nash equilibrium offer us a powerful tool for understanding this. Note that game theory and Nash equilibrium are named after a man named John Nash. If you've never watched It's a Beautiful Mind, it's a fantastic movie. I highly recommend, but it's the story of John Nash and the math theory and his discovery of game theory. So what is the game theory and Nash equilibrium? Well, basically, as we mentioned, game theory is a study of strategic games. Nash equilibrium, however, is a specific, unique situation with a game, and that is a situation in which economic actors interact, each choose their strategy given the strategies that all other actors have chosen. Or another way of putting this is that if I know what someone else is going to do, what's the decision that leads to the best outcome? When both actors make that decision, that is considered a Nash equilibrium. It also means there's no incentive for individuals to change their minds and change their strategy. So in summary, when a firms in an oligopoly individually choose production to maximize profit, they produce a quantity of output greater than the level produced by monopoly and less than the level by perfect competition. The oligopoly price is then less than the monopoly, but greater than, which equals marginal cost. How does the size of an oligopoly affect the market outcome? Well, oligopoly's production is determined by two factors. These two factors, by the way, explain why we saw the profit and revenue can maximize at 60 and then decline once the output goes up from there. And the simple reason is, first, the output effect, and that is because prices above marginal cost, selling one more gallon of water at the going price will. So again, the idea that the more you sell, the more profit this should generate. However, going against this is and that's the idea that raising production will increase the total amount sold, which will lower the price and lower the profit on all the other gallons sold. So you might remember from our Monopoly chapter, we talked a little bit about how the monopolist, to sell an additional unit, has to. That same problem exists in the oligopoly model. So what are the economics of cooperation in this model? Well, let's introduce this game. This simple game is called the Prisoner's Dilemma. And it's a particular game between two people that captures, or two captured prisoners. Why? Even when it is. And to understand this, we need to understand the concept of a dominant or a strategy that is the best for a player, regardless of the strategies chosen by the other player. Basically, this means that it doesn't matter the other people are going to choose. This is the single best strategy for you. So let's zoom in. And the game setup we have is two individuals, Bonnie and Clyde, named after the famous gangsters, of course. And Bonnie and Clyde are arrested, and they have the facing them and confess, i.e., confess to their crime, take full acceptance responsibility, also partially blame the other person. Alternatively, they can admit, which in this case is basically not confessing. This is saying nothing, saying you ain't got anything on. And let's look at what the outcomes are. So let's just, for example, look at Bonnie. Bonnie has the option of if she confesses and Clyde confesses, if she confesses and Clyde remains silent, or however, look at this. Bonnie goes free while Clyde gets 20 years. So what we find for Bonnie, right, is that she will get 8 years if she confesses, and she will go free if she confesses and Clyde remains silent. Now let's look at contrast to her other options. What happens if Bonnie remains silent? Well, she gets 20 years if Clyde confesses. So we see a switch here, right? Clyde goes free, Bonnie gets 20 years. However, if she remains silent and Clyde remains, Bonnie now gets 1 year in jail. So this introduces us to the concept of dominant strategy. Notice that if Bonnie confesses, she will either get 8 years in the event that Clyde confesses versus 20 years if Clyde confesses. So if Clyde is to confess, Bonnie should confess. She gets a lighter than if she were. Similarly, if Bonnie confesses and Clyde remains silent, then she goes free, as opposed to if she remains silent, she would get 1 year in jail. Now, this is where things get tricky and show us the importance of a Nash equilibrium and dominant strategy. Bonnie should always confess because Bonnie will get a better outcome regardless of what Clyde chooses. However, if we flip this and look at it from Clyde's perspective, he has the exact same questions and challenges that Bonnie has facing her. So again, Clyde has the exact same problem that Bonnie has. If he confesses, he'll get 8 years if Bonnie, and he'll go if Bonnie remains silent. Similarly, if he remains silent, he will go get 20 years in jail if Bonnie confesses, and get 1 year in jail if he decides to remain silent. since an 8-year sentence is better than a 20-year sentence and going free is better than a 1-year sentence, Clyde also finds that confessing is the dominant strategy. What this means is that we call the strategy by both of them to call this a dominant strategy in a Nash equilibrium. So the dominant strategy for both, the outcome of confess is what we call a Nash equilibrium. And the reason this is a Nash equilibrium is that both Bonnie and Clyde are responding in the best way they know possible, given that they know the other person's best strategy is also to confess. Now, this leads us to a really interesting problem, right? Because if we know both going to confess, it makes sense then, if they were sitting in the room, right, to be 1 year each is better than 8 years each. So why don't they both remain silent? This is one of the wonders of game theory and why it's such an incredible field, is that game theory discovered that individuals acting in their best interest and acting exclusively in their interest actually doesn't necessarily lead to the most efficient outcome for the interest. Bonnie and Clyde, again, both would probably rather have 1 year in jail as opposed to 8. However, as game theory shows, if they both act as rational individuals, they will wind up in a Nash equilibrium of confessing and getting 8-year sentences. Now, what does this mean for production? Well, similarly, we find that oligopolies face a prisoner's dilemma. The question now is whether you produce a lot or you produce little. Now, if we zoom in here, what we see is we will focus on Jack and Jill doing their little water production. Apparently, it can be quite violent. Jack has been known to break his. However, if we look at this model and breakdown, what do you notice? Jack and Jill will both get $1,600 if there's a high production, if they both choose a high production. However, if one chooses a high production and the other chooses a low production, let's say in this case Jill chooses a high production and chooses a low production, Jill would get $2,000 profit and Jack would get $1,500. However, if both choose low production, then Jack gets $1,800 profit and Jill gets $1,800. So, what are they going to choose to do? Yeah, that's right. They're both going to pick high production. Why? Because while we recognize that 1,800 is better than 1,600, notice Jack and Jill both have an incentive to switch to a high production strategy, right? If they're both producing at a low level and say Jill sees that Jack is producing low and knows he's producing low, she can make an extra $200 profit if she switches to high production. Similarly, Jack faces the same question. While low production, he's making $800 and he sees Jill making $1,800. For Jack, it makes sense for him to switch to a high production and try to get $2,000 as well. What this means is that without collusion, we'll see again a Nash equilibrium, high production. And notice that this outcome is not the best outcome for either one. In fact, they get barely a marginal profit than if they were losers in the high-low production. But again, the reason why this is a Nash equilibrium is because there's no incentive for Jack and Jill to switch their decisions. They are responding in the best way possible to the other person's strategy. Right? Because let's look at this. Let's say that we both wind up, if Jack tries to switch to low production, right, he loses money and winds up with $1,500. So he has no incentive to switch from high production water to low production water. And similarly, Jill faces the same question. Low production because it will drive as well. Now, the cool thing about is that game theory, excuse me, I think we might have some slight technical difficulties. There we go. I think we're back. The cool thing about game theory, however, is that we actually have a bunch of different examples we can rely on. For example, an arms race game is another way we model game theory, and this is typical in fields like international relations. So the United States and the USSR are trying to figure out whether or not to build nuclear weapons or not. If they both disarm, notice that both countries make sense why they'd want to disarm them, right? Like that seems reasonable. Except there's one problem. What happens if the United States chooses to arm while the Soviet Union chooses to disarm? Well, now the US is safe and powerful, while the USSR is at risk and now weak. So what this game shows us is that ultimately the Soviet Union faces the same thing. If they choose to arm while the US is disarmed, the US is at risk and weak, and the USSR is safe and powerful. And so basically we find a Nash equilibrium again occurs, this time at arm. And the reason why is that while it seems like it makes sense for both countries to choose to disarm and stay at safe rather than be at risk, while both countries are safe at disarm, there's an incentive for both countries to shift their strategy to armament. Why is that? Because again, let's look at the outcome. If the United States chooses to arm, they're at risk if the Soviets arm, but they're safe and powerful if they disarm. In contrast, if they choose to disarm and the Soviets choose to arm, they're at risk and now, all right, so they're at a worse outcome than if they had chosen to arm in the Soviets. Similarly, while if they choose to disarm, they'll be safe. If the Soviets disarmed and the United States armed, the US would be safe. And so the point of Nash equilibrium is to again show us how, while there seems like reasonable outcomes, why those reasonable outcomes don't occur. One final example for common resources game. We talked about common resources in chapter 12, I believe. Yes, chapter 12. And common resources are the extraction problem, right? Tragedy, the commons. We can see a common resources game here where both Texaco and Exxon could choose to restrict their oil drilling, thereby preserving the value of oil and preserving the amount of oil available. However, based upon the same problems we've run into, we're going to see that both have an incentive to shift to. So if Exxon chooses to drill 2 wells, they get $4 million profit if Texaco drills 2 wells, and they get $6 million profit if Texaco drills 1 well. But that drilling 2 wells then is a dominant strategy again. Why? Because if Exxon drills 1 well, they get $3 million profit, and if Exxon drills 1 well while drills 1 well and Texaco drills 1 well, they get $5 million profit. So again, both Texaco and Exxon in this case, since they're mirrored out, have an incentive to produce 2 wells. And ultimately what this means is that tragedy of the commons persists. Why? Because we're exhausting common resources faster than we need to, because the incentive is there. So what does this tell us about societal welfare? It's difficult to determine the prisoner's dilemma benefit. Collusion seems normally bad for society, but a lack of collusion also creates problems. See our arms race example. So it's a little bit of, who do we want colluding? Nations to diplomacy? Sure. Producers in our sports team? That's not. Does this mean collusion and cooperation can't happen? No. In fact, it's quite possible in repeated games that have specified penalties for deviation. To give you an example of this, let's consider for a moment that if you keep playing the prisoner's dilemma again over and over for the water Jack and Jill producing, eventually both might realize they're going to hype and they can have the benefits of low production. What this means is that ultimately it makes sense to turn around and shift and start pricing more competitively with one another and trying to restrict their production. But there's a better real-world example you can think of. One of the biggest oligopolies in the world today, and certainly one prevalent around the holidays, Microsoft and Sony. and the Xbox and PlayStation. These two companies have started and launched now 4 different console generations in competition with one another. And what they found is that when one of them priced higher than the other, they succinctly lost, and they lost dramatically. So what have Sony and Microsoft resolved to doing now? Well, typically they play a game of chicken to see what the other one's price is going to be. And in this game of chicken, when one of them announces their price, typically the other company now responds and prices at the same level. And so this is the sort of game of chicken that's come out from the prisoner's dilemma. So to give you the latest example, the Xbox and PlayStation took several months to announce their price before Xbox Series X announced a price of $500. What did Sony do for the PS5? Well, it announced a similar price level, $500 as well. Why? Because both companies know being overly priced compared to their competitor makes one firm lose money, and so they tend to be competitively priced. Similarly, the cost of production then means that why would they sabotage their own profits if they could undercut this competition? Well, the answer is no. They both want to be fairly kind of, and this is an example of how repeated games, Microsoft and Sony releasing multiple console generations, ultimately leads both to create a game and response where there isn't necessarily. Now, just a few notes here in TED-Bits to wrap up. What are our public policy towards oligopoly? Well, in general, the U.S. has restrained and prevent collusion from it. So the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 codified and reinforced U.S. policy towards limited cross-national. Basically, we prevented the United States from being a part of an international cartel. And then we strengthened this in 1914 with the Clayton Act. Ultimately became relevant in 1983. The CEO of American Airlines was caught trying to openly, blatantly collude with competitors. Now, there's some controversies. What is resale price maintenance? i.e., where wholesalers sell to retailers and demand retailers sell at a specified price. Is this collusion? A firm is asking all the retail sellers to follow the same price. It's not aimed at reducing competition, but rather ensures firms can't take advantage of differences in services. An example here is Best Buy just Amazon's showroom, since they offer prices? The point here is that business practices that appear to may in fact have legitimate purposes. Predatory pricing is another big question. This is cutting prices to undercut competition, force them from the market, and then upcharge following their competitors' limit. But there's a debate if this actually is a problem. Are firms wolves or coyotes? Is the firm under the or is it predatory in hunting, looking to take out its competition and then cut price? The answer is most people tend to lean towards firms being more coyotes, scavengers, trying to sell where they can and make headway in the market. Finally, tying. This is offering 2 products exclusively for a single price. And actually, this is not to really be an anti-competitive example. This is simply simply a version of bundling by which companies are able to sell products they might not otherwise have sold and ensure availability and access to other products. This is typically the case with movie theaters, where movie theaters often take a very high-valued film and tie it to a lesser of a and so where does this leave us? Collusion and game oligopolies as a whole are actually very fascinating. And one comes from this is, should the NCAA be taken to court? Isn't it just a cartel of universities and collegiate sports? It allows them to protect the value and their earnings at the cost of workers, in this case athletes, it's a real serious. But there's plenty of other oligopoly markets from here. These are questions for another time. And anyways, hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know if you have any questions. And as we get into the future, we're going to transition to labor market. Till next time.